The goal of a sniper is to remove a single target. The goal of the insurgent is to create 1,000 mediocre snipers. Warfare is a word that is oftentimes used to create a sense of urgency. And this podcast oftentimes remains within the field or within kind of the microcosm of gun culture. And so if you're coming from that community, you will be on common ground. But if you are not coming from the world of the gun culture as a whole, then listen in, because this is pertinent to your life. Warfare is, I will return to the beginning. Warfare is a word that is oftentimes used to create a sense of urgency. It is used in books and literature to inspire people to commit themselves to some meaningful cause that will include sacrifice, and then oftentimes lead to cultural change, global change, power change. And we are going to talk about the difference between the insurgent and the sniper, or the insurgent and the assassin. And if you are someone who has grown up in the same era that I have, we're going to talk a little bit about the video game called Assassin's Creed. This is the Redacted Culture Cast, a podcast that is the strange but also very reasonable, well, not even, I can argue that it's reasonable, but combination of the world of violence and the world of philosophy, and why we make decisions and how to do them better. In fact, I want to be specific. I can even argue, in fact, but the point is that we are in a world where, whether you're familiar with the term fifth generation warfare or just that of the insurgency, ergo January 6th, we are in that time frame. I'm going to harken back to probably one of my favorite scenes in Lord of the Rings, which is in The Return of the King, where Gandalf is talking to Pippin, and Pippin is talking about how dark the world is, and Gandalf is mentioning about how we don't get to exactly choose where we are at in the timeline, only to use what tools we have for the best of our ability to try to make the world better. Now, this podcast is sponsored. It's sponsored by Obsidian Arms, and Obsidian Arms represents many of the facets of gun culture, whether you are shooting competition or you're looking to build a tool for your own purposes, or if you are trying to achieve some level of self-sufficiency. They have a set of toolkits that come with a lifetime warranty, which is one of those things that takes the sting out of that element of self-sufficiency. So if you want to become better at maintaining your own equipment, I highly recommend looking at their toolkits, whether it's for an AR-15 or general gunsmithing as well. And in addition, if you are bringing a business idea to this community, then they provide a pathway for you to take that idea, whether it's a sketch or a CAD design, and turn it into something real. Now, they primarily work with metal, but it's worth reaching out to them. So if you want to support the show and support our sponsor, our first sponsor, go over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Now, the term insurgency is a muddy term. It is one of those words, kind of like fifth generation warfare, that gets kind of slapped onto things for the purpose of adding this sense of urgency. It is important. It is critical. It is happening now. We need to be aware of it. How do I make you aware of it? Is that really what my role is to be? But there are a series of books that I have presented, and I want to illustrate the difference between something like the sniper or the assassin and the insurgent, because I believe it is pertinent to your life. Warfare has changed. It has changed dramatically in our lifetime, as well as the few generations before us. And I'm talking about the greatest generation being World War II into Korea, into probably kind of coming to an end during Vietnam. And then we have what is called the boomer generation that really is growing up during Vietnam conflict. And extending itself into what eventually became the global war on terror. But then we have millennials, we have Zoomers, we have whatever you want to call them, Gen Z, so on and so forth. And why warfare has changed is a different conversation than how warfare has changed. One of the advantages of studying philosophy is that you're capable of becoming specific with terms. How a thing happened is different than why a thing happened. How it happened is a series of events or mechanisms, or maybe you can talk about the history of philosophy and how we went from the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern age, or, and these are these kind of explanations of how the mechanism of belief has changed over time. But it also is able to, or should be able to, and I argue that it should be able to distinguish between why they changed. And an example of this in short term is why did we move from the Enlightenment era to the postmodern era? And one key example that's often given is World War I, where before World War I, you had this great kind of belief in rationalism, that we could use logic and reason to find our way into the future and solve mankind's problems. And then after World War I, because of the great, we won't call it atrocities, even though that might be correct in definition, the great death that happened in World War I led to a sort of pessimism in the capability of reason. That reason was not enough to define where we were at. And World War I was the how it happened is World War I is the how, but the why is explained in how before World War I, it's still one of those words that just kind of doesn't roll off the tongue very well, but why World War I happened is quite different from how the effects of World War I changed people's mentality. So, being specific with this term, not to hat to Jordan Peterson, how World War I happened was a series of political and cultural events that led to conflicts between nations. There were decrees and there were agreements that we would support one another in certain situations. But why World War I is the kind of nail in the coffin between the rationalistic approach that we could, through reason and logic, ascertain all world's problems, to what happened after is that you had all these supposedly rational countries that went to war against each other and produced as not before seen by these people at this time, a massive killing without any reason or rationality to it. And so we're talking in this episode about not only the how insurgency is different than the sniper or the assassin, but why it is different and what we get from it. So as we began this episode, the goal of the sniper is to eliminate an individual. It is to kill an officer. If you were to look at pre-American Revolution War up into the American Revolution, you saw this great emphasis in trying to remove leaders from battle. Now, how this might have become a strategy could be described by things like conscription or the draft, or how most soldiers, most fighters before the Napoleonic War were not exactly full-time employed fighters. They had other jobs, they had other tasks, but they were called to the duty of their country. And they were called by people who held specific positions. And a sniper or an assassin, if we were going to call back to Assassin's Creed, the goal of that individual was to remove the head of power, cut the head off the snake, to remove the sense of organization and leadership from an opposing army. If you could remove the leadership from an army, you could immediately cripple their capability to act. But that changed over time. That changed in what would become the global war on terror, but also the rise of special operations and decentralized leadership. The sniper or the assassin's goal was to kill a specific target, but after the nuclear bomb became a reality in warfare, the capacity, the cap of warfare changed. And that cap was changed because in an instant, a government or a military could delete an entire military or an entire army or an entire organization just with one bomb, one tool. And so warfare had to change. It's not going to go away, but it had to change. And that change took place in the rise of insurgency, which it itself is nothing new. Insurgencies typically follow empires, but the insurgency, the idea of insurgency, is a term that I want to clarify in this episode. I introduced with it, I'll say it again, that the goal of a sniper or assassin is to kill a single target. But the goal of an insurgent is to produce a multitude of mediocre snipers. The goal of an insurgency, as written by, what's his name? Kilcullen? This is an author who wrote one of the more important books on insurgency, is that the goal of also the War of the Flea by Tabor, is that an insurgency's goal is to create a bunch of rebels. It is to break the will of the people from their current community, culture, and government. Now, community, culture, and government are all tied to each other in these wire bonds that are, well, demonstrably pretty solid, but the best example of it is a culture is a description of the common beliefs of a people. The community is the people themselves, and the government is what those people produce as their organization structure. And if we were to talk about classical armies, the Iliad, the generals, the leaders, the heroes, if you could remove Achilles from the battlefield, you would change dramatically the effectiveness of the opponent's ability to fight. And so as warfare has progressed, we have moved away from the actions of the individual. In one sense, we've actually moved away from the actions of the leader to the actions of all of the individuals involved. This is reflected in Lieutenant Colonel Grossman's book on killing, where a very small percentage of the people who participated in warfare, is it on killing or on combat? I might be mistaken. But it's a very small a group of individuals or people who participate in war do the majority of the work. You might get something called the Pareto distribution, where 20 or 80% of the work is accomplished by 20% of the people. And this is how insurgency takes root in our world, because instead of targeting those 20% of individuals who do 80% of the work, it is actually targeting the 80% of people to turn them against the 20%. I can illustrate this in another way. A sniper might attack a general, but the insurgent attacks, in quotes, the people. The goal of an insurgency is to turn the will of the people against their community, culture, and government. The goal of an insurgency, and I believe this is Tabor in the War of the Flea, is to take the individual, or to address the people in a society who do not feel connected to their society, and turn them into weapons against their own community. Now, this is best illustrated by Why Young Men by Jamil Jivani. And I have this book in front of me right now, and I highly recommend anyone who is in the military as well as in law enforcement read it. But Why Young Men illustrates in its early chapters how organizations would use sort of religious institutions to create or to provide a sense of meaning for otherwise disaffected young men and turn them into weapons of a sort against the creators, the creators of the organization's political and social opponents. And this is the is side of the guillotine. This is the is versus the ought. And I'm talking about what is and what does happen within insurgency, and we will conclude with the ought and how do you meet it. So the is part of insurgency attacks the people. And it attacks the people by harnessing, capturing, or enticing, or even inciting their cultural conflicts for the purpose of creating division. It wants to create division to turn those people into revolutionaries. Revolution itself is not evil or good. Revolution is a thing. It is something that happens when a collection or a group of people within a government and a nation or a society revolt successfully, mostly, against the government to essentially revolve the government or the structure of that society from one thing to another. And the is, as in how does, not the why, but the how of revolution is excellently described in Why Young Men by Jamil Jivani. But that doesn't answer how we ought respond. So to remain on the is. Culture, community, and government exist in an environment where people have some form of common ground. Then it degrades, and it oftentimes can degrade in multiple ways, but it can be weaponized against itself by finding the people who do not feel properly connected to that environment and turning them into weapons, trying to convince other people in that society that they are not actually supported by their own culture and their own government. This is why this is why calling the January 6th event as an insurgency holds an element of truth, even though there is a heavy-handed political narrative attached to it. But an insurgency's goal is to create the revolutionary. It's to try to convince other people that their government is not in support of their interests. It doesn't care about their values. It's actually there to undermine them. Whereas you get Marxism, the infinite, never-ending insurgency. But what ought we do? How ought we solve this? This leads to a book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb called Skin in the Game. And Skin in the Game illustrates how where the further a person comes, or the further a person is removed from the consequences of their actions, the less intelligent and capable they are. So if you take a person and you remove him from the environment where he is effective, you remove him from the consequences of his actions, he becomes less intelligent, less capable of operating, functioning, engaging successfully. And I'm going to make an argument here that the idea of skin in the game is illustrating how insurgency is bringing warfare to the individual. Classic war, von Clausewitz's war, would want to target generals, armies, and capacity for arming those armies. But the warfare that we are engaged in our age is not interested in attacking the armies, but turning the people of a country against their own government and their own armies. It in fact is a war against the people. Let's use this as an example. If a foreign government were to use a non-government organization like a religion, a church, a theology, or an organization like a cartel to turn people or weaponize them against their own society, they would be engaging in this kind of fifth generation warfare as illustrated. But they are not going to war against an army. They are trying to go to war against a people to turn them into useful idiots to fight on their behalf. Instead of me going to fight in a foreign country, I'm going to find people within that country who do not feel happy with its current operation and turn them into fighters for the express purpose of overturning the current way of events. That means in our current era of warfare, you and I are the target. And that would be a good thing if we adhered to the principles of skin in the game, because we would be able to look at ourselves as the essentially front line of defense against people who are attacking not just us, but are trying to manipulate us into becoming weapons against our own well-being. And if we remove individual agency being a philosophical term for an individual's ability and understanding to make meaningful actions within their environment, if we were to try to strip that of people but give them a false agency, that they're freeing themselves, they're liberating themselves from some sort of patriarchy, racism, or whatever, then we would be arming them to undermine their own government, their own community, their own culture for the express purpose of eventually taking it over. This isn't particularly anything new. And so how is this relevant to you and I? How is this relevant to gun culture and those outside of it? It's that the idea of warfare is changed. It's not standing armies moving against one another in convenient movements with tanks or horses or chariots, whatever. Warfare is particularly against the citizens. In other words, we are all at war, but we are also never at classic war. That the attacks that can be made against you are not intended on destroying the armies that protect your country, but turning you into a weapon against your own community. It's actually effectively a religious war. Everything has to be against your community. You are the person who organizes a community against your way of life. And the solution being illustrated in the American military's rise of the special operations soldier, is that if you strip the individual of making the decisions, or you prevent them by conventional means, then they are less effective. Therefore, and this is, I know I've made this confusing, and I recognize it in my own head, it's that what illustrates and defines special operations, or should define special operations, or the individuals individual actors, which most likely will become the new norm, is that the individual is made capable of making decisions. They are allowed. Their individual agency is actually respected, and they are trusted to make decisions that will impact the nation as a whole. So insurgency is an excellent tool against bureaucracy, because bureaucracy strips everybody of agency. But by being stripped of agency, individuals are less capable of addressing their terms. This means, as a business owner, if you don't teach your employees to be able to make decisions and then show that you trust them, you will weaken your business against the quote-unquote insurgent. If you are a government, or you are an army, and you are someone in position of authority, an officer of some sorts, and you demean your soldiers to the point of not having individual agency, they will become weaker as soldiers by design of an insurgency. Instead, and why this is relevant, is that if you feel a sense that moral injuries are being inflicted upon you, they are being inflicted upon you by a form of insurgency. Your ability to participate in the world is in a sense under attack, but it is not enough to understand that we are under attack, but it is more important to understand how, where, and by whom. How you are under attack is that your agency is being stripped by people who have been convinced by malicious actors that you do not deserve agency. You are a serf, you are a slave, we are moving back to feudalism. The way to resist that and to bring health and life to your culture and your community is to reject the premise that you yourself are not capable of participating in your environment, to reject the premise that you are responsible for your actions, but you are not given the authority to act upon them, and to once again remember that skin in the game is most important. This is why a sheriff's election might be more important to you in your current timeline than a presidential election. It's not that neither of them are unimportant, but we have to rank them in a hierarchy. The people that you have influence over, whether it is your mayor, your sheriff, your school board member, is more important because those are the people who are being targeted by your enemies to turn your community and culture against you. That is the how. The why, again, is that the closer you are to the problem, the smarter you ought to be, or you should be, or you will be in addressing its problem. And so while we exist in this politics, government cycle of a presidential election, remember that this too will pass, but what you have influence over is what you should function in authority over. It's a broad topic. It's a hard topic to broach quickly, but we have addressed it as best we can. And so once again, thank you for listening to the Redacted Culture Cast, which talks about gun culture, morality, philosophy, insurgency, and the new ways of war. Thank you for listening. If you want to support us, you can head over to redactedllc.com. Although by the time this goes live, the shop will be closed for some time. We'll reopen it soon. Or you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com to get discounts on anything you purchase from our shop, as well as discounts from Obsidian Arms. That being the case, go forth and conquer.